Efendim, Keynote speaker'ımızla gerçekleşecek oturumumuza hoş geldiniz öncelikle. Aramızda çok önemli bir konuğumuz var. Keynote speaker'ımız Profesör Mark Twain. Kendisinden kısaca bahsetmek istiyorum. Akademisyen, yazar ve kültür teorisyeni Mark Twain, Brunel Üniversitesi Film ve Televizyon bölümünde öğretim üyesidir. Resistant Voices, The Politics of Television and Cultural Change'in editörüdür. Marksizm ve medya araştırmaları, anahtar kavramlar, çağdaş eğilimler, politik film, 3. sinemanın diyalektiği, yeni başlayanlar için kapital, sinemayı anlamak, Marksist perspektifler yazarının Türkçe'ye çevrilmiş eserleridir. Ertan Tunç'tan da bahsetmek isterim. Kendisi bu oturumda moderatörümüz olacak. Ertan Tunç, Yıldız Teknik Üniversitesi'nde ekonomi lisansından sonra İstanbul Teknik Üniversitesi'nde yüksek lisans yapmıştır ve kendisi şu anda felsefe doktorası yapmaktadır. Buyurun hocam, söz sizde.
Teşekkür ediyorum. Welcome to our session. Now we have a very precious guest here, Mr. Mike Twain. Mike Twain is from Brunel University and in film and media studies. Also, he is working on other topics like Marxism, Marxist philosophy, and political philosophy. He will make a presentation about dialectical image.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the organising committee for inviting me here and being such wonderful hosts as well. So I'm going to talk about, the title of my talk is Dialectical Images, and I'm going to first of all talk a bit about what that means and why it's important, and then I'm going to illustrate those issues in relation to two films from Chile, Valparaíso by Joris Ivens, 1963, and The Settlers by Felipe Galvez, 2023, that's 60 years later. And I'm told that both these films are on Turkish Mubi, so I'm hoping many of you will have seen them. Okay, so the aims of the talk are firstly to recover dialectical thought as a weapon against the breakdown in social and historical thinking, which results from reification, a term I will come back to and explain. I want to make the case that dialectical images help nourish and revivify dialectical thought, and the vice versa, the other way, dialectical thought helps nourish dialectical images. I'm going to talk a little bit about what dialectical images look like, what their strategies are, and how they emerged out of political modernism in the first decades of the 20th century. I want to show that dialectical images are not in opposition to narrative storytelling, because that's one of the legacies of political modernism, the sense that dialectical images are anti-narrative. And I want to say that that's not necessarily the case. And as I say, I'm going to look at two films to help us think about these issues. So, reification means literally turning social relationships into things. This passage, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, from Marx's Capital, Volume 1. The interesting thing about this passage, which talks about roots, the word reification is not Marx, it comes from Weber and Lukács, but it's rooted in commodity fetishism. And in this section, Marx is talking about commodity fetishism. And interestingly, he makes sight, the visual sense, a problem, an issue, because at first sight, the commodity appears easily comprehensible, easily apprehended, easily known. But in fact it is, as he puts it, abounding in metaphysical subtleties, and it is in fact a mysterious thing. Because in the commodity, the social relationships out of which the commodity emerges have disappeared. They've been bracketed off, they've been eclipsed. And as a result, the social world appears to be made up of things that are moving according to their own laws, their own dynamics, a pure objectivity. And that's why Marx uses the metaphor of a stamp. The social character of the productive men's labour, the productive output of our capacities, have an objective character stamped upon them. And that metaphor of a stamp, a machine-like, purely objective quality where agency has disappeared, is characteristic of reification. And it has lots of other motifs and features. It's changing constantly, but it's unchanging. It's fragmented, but it's also a world of totalizing power that touches every aspect of our lives. Confronted with this, the visual sense or images might seem like an odd ally, because here is Marx saying that the visual is a limited form of knowledge. And if you look at French philosophy, there is an epistemic horror of the visual image. Think of Lacan's mirror stage and the imaginary, or Foucault's panopticon, or Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle. In all these cases, the image is the enemy. It is the place where people become oppressed, manipulated. It's the place of self-delusion. So how can images be something else? How can they be liberatory? How can they be cognitively rewarding? This is the question that we need to address, and I want to kind of make an argument about. It's not a new argument, but it's worth having again. So, some sources for dialectical thought. Obviously, Darwinian materialism. Marx wanted to dedicate Capital to Charles Darwin. Darwin declined the offer. But Darwin's idea that material nature is a place of conflict, a site of struggle, but an open-ended, non-teleological process where there is no divine presence, is clearly an important source of dialectical thinking. Epicurus, ancient Greek philosophy. Epicurus was the subject of Marx's doctoral thesis, and Epicurus looked at nature as a site for stimulating. You hear me? Yeah? So Epicurus looked at nature as a site for... Hello? Hello? Yeah, maybe it's back again. So for Epicurus, nature was a way of stimulating thinking about how nature is transforming all the time. And he was particularly interested in death and decomposition, because that showed that nature never reduced to zero. That showed nature never reduced to zero, but was always transforming in itself, transforming the forms, if you like. And death and decomposition were important motifs in the work of Siegfried Krakow and Walter Benjamin. They used death and decay as a way of puncturing the self-confidence of the commodity world in their own time. That sense of the commodity being a kind of eternally youthful and permanent phenomena. Then there's Kant. Kant began the development of the idea that the subject is not just a passive receiver of external stimuli, but actively works on the stimuli that they receive, synthesizing that material, drawing it into concepts within this kind of transcendental machinery of consciousness that he was developing in the Critique of Pure Reason. Sense perception was a problem for Kant, though, because it is rooted in time and space and seems to be, doesn't seem to offer the universality that he was looking for cognitive thought. So he subordinated sense perception under this kind of, if you like, conceptual machinery of this transcendental consciousness, ahistorical. Hegel tried to develop this, but what's important about Kant is, as I said, you can't have dialectical images unless you've got a subject that is doing some work on the material, and his model begins to develop that. Hegel then takes that on further. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, he talks about sensuous certainty being an inadequate form of truth that has to be situated within enlarged context. In other words, the idea of mediation, that you mediate sense perception into larger contexts. And you can see here that idea, how that idea would be a weapon against the decontextualizing process of commodification or rarefication. And then Marx, if you like, historicizes and materializes this idea of mediation further. He notes that for Hegel, the main point is that the object of consciousness is nothing else but self-consciousness, that the object is only objectified self-consciousness. So for Hegel doesn't actually escape the limits of an idealist current. Oops. Brilliant. So how do we link Marx, who historicizes and materializes this emerging dialectical thinking, to political modernism in the 20th century? We cannot do it by looking at Marx's preferences for the 19th century novel. He was a big fan of Charles Dickens. The link between Marx and political modernism is really there in Marx's sixth thesis on Feuerbach, where he says that the human essence is not an abstraction in each individual, but is in the ensemble of social relationships. Excuse me. And this idea of the ensemble of social relationships is really what links Marx to, if you like, a constructivist philosophy that really emerges in the 20th century and becomes the cornerstone, really, of modernism and also political modernism, because this is a philosophy that understands that the world is a construct. It is made, it can be remade and unmade. But not only the world is a construct, but how we comprehend and apprehend the world, how we make the world intelligible to us, is also a construct, and it can be made and remade in different ways, and that there are choices and selections to be had which have political significance. This all flows into the political modernism of the 20th century. So we can start with Kuleshov in Russia, with his experiments, really experiments in the ensemble of film relations. And he starts off by his famous experiment where he notes that the meaning of a shot, what an actor's face might mean, for example, whether it means desire or hunger, depends on the image that it is cut with. So here we see very clearly, if you like, something specific about the aesthetic, its semantic formal structure, that it can create its own context of meaning. And this is very important, because if you can create your own context of meaning, you can change the meanings that are in circulation outside that context. You can subvert them. You can begin to do some dialectical work on them. For Eisenstein, the dialectical image is about the organization of the language of film into tensions and conflicts, the formal language, in order to a kind of orchestration of the elements of film language to produce what he called a montage of attractions. These are shocks to the shocking stimuli that aim to impact on one's cognitive or emotional understandings, as here in his attempts to generate from the sensuous, non-sensuous, moral, political ideas the meaning of Tsarism in Russia in this 1905 recreation, Battleship Potemkin. So this link between the sensuous particular and the specific nature of the sensuous particular in the aesthetic to the non-sensuous ideas that have a kind of critical, cognitive, emotional cut-through that can help dismantle the kind of rarefication effects outside the artistic work is what I'm trying to convey. John Hartfield is trying to here escape with his photo montages the limitations of the single image, the single photograph, through juxtaposition, again creating tension and conflicts at a formal level, in order again to generate non-sensuous ideas. For example, here, Hitler's big business backers, or the way Hitler or Nazism appropriated certain Marxist ideas, or language to try and kind of win over the masses. So at the same time that the dialectical image is being practiced and developed, you've got a mass industry, a mass culture industry, producing a gargantuan volume of images to sell, to seduce, to propagandize, to normalize and desensitize. This is the mass culture industries that produced what Benjamin called the phantasmagoria. And the First World War was a watershed moment that revealed to states, to propagandists, to communication experts, public relations people. It revealed just how powerful communication is as a means of persuasion. So here we have a First World War propaganda image, and literally you can see this sort of Althusserian concept of interpolation, of addressing the subject and fitting them into the social apparatus. Here, literally it says, you know, this is your space. Enter into this slot in the war machine. Will you fit it? Yes, is the answer. So it's against this kind of, this mass culture that's being generated by the corporate and state apparatus that the dialectical image is trying to combat. And at the same time, critical thought is feeding into the dialectical image, and critical thought is critiquing the reification of this mass culture apparatus. So Siegfried Krakauer's 1927 article, The Mass Ornament, is really the foundation for subsequent study of mass culture. And in that essay, he talks about the Tiller Girls. Here, up there on the left. The Tiller Girls were a popular dance troupe, synchronized dancing in the early 20th century. And he saw this as an allegory or a metaphor for regimentation and standardization demanded by industrial production. And then the Busby Berkeley movies in Hollywood sort of developed this further, and you can see once the women are pulled into the machinery of the cinematographic apparatus, how the body becomes even more rarefied, turned into pure geometry. And Krakauer talked about aerial photographs as a way of kind of trying to imagine as a metaphor for rarefication. He said, the ornament resembles aerial photographs of landscapes and cities, and that it does not emerge out of the interior of the given conditions, but rather rises above them. So that sense that, you know, the products of our own products don't emerge out of us, but are imposed upon us by these rarefied relations. And visuality is the kind of way of either, if you like, internalizing that or critiquing it. Walter Benjamin talked about dialectics at a standstill. So here we get that sense of the dialectical image freezing linear time, disrupting the flow of time in order to study and inspect what's going on. As he says, thinking involves not only the flow of thoughts, but their arrest as well, in a configuration pregnant with tensions. So again, that sense of, by stopping the flow of time, you can analyze the tensions and conflicts within it. So the dialectical image is a spatializing, has a spatializing dimension. In order to disrupt time, it spatializes things. And here in this collage by Brecht, you've got three different times colliding. You've got kind of a sort of fitness time, you've got work time, and you've got war time, all coming together in the same image. So the dialectical image, it can be traced back further to the work of Kant, especially the critique of judgment. So in the critique of judgment, Kant is trying to actually escape the effects of his own philosophy in the Critique of Pure Judgment. I've said that Kant develops a model where the subject has some activity. Kant doesn't just accept external stimuli, but works on that stimuli. He talks about synthesizing sense perception, and then, if you like, drawing that sense perception under a concept that makes sense of it. But the Critique of Pure Reason is a very rarefied model. In fact, it's very automated. There's very little for the individual subject to do. There is very little space for moral judgment, for example, and he recognized this in his own philosophy. He recognized the contradiction. So he tried to address it in the Critique of Judgment and tried to bring back in some individual ability to make a moral political judgment. He wouldn't have called it political judgment, but morals and politics are closely connected. So he develops what he calls reflective judgment. And you can see here the origin of the dialectical image. To reflect or consider is to hold given presentations up to and compare them with either other presentations or one's cognitive power itself in reference to a concept that this comparison makes possible. So he's talking about comparisons, he's talking about juxtapositions, he's talking about bringing these presentations together just as they are, you can see in the work of Eisenstein and Hartfield and Benjamin and Brecht, in order to generate an idea that it was not possible to think of before. When he talks about bringing up a presentation that can refer to one's own cognitive power, he's really alluding to the sublime, where raging nature shakes our concepts so much that they begin to break down. But that stimulates our thinking for non-sensuous concepts, non-sensuous ideas. So for Kant, it might be a metaphysical concept like infinity, but for us it might be, globalized capitalism, a very non-sensuous phenomenon. But somehow we've got to try and find a way of glimpsing it through the visual sense. So it might be, for example, that looking at a city, we might be able to find a comparison between a city and, if you like, an aesthetic artwork itself, the aesthetic as a totality, a miniature totality, a comparison within which we could sort of work through and think critically about the city. So that brings us on to Alvaro Paraiso, 1963. The film was a Franco-Chilean co-production. It came out of some work that was being done at the University of Santiago. They were inviting Western filmmakers and cineasts over to Chile, and Joris Ivens went there in 1962 for a retrospective of his work, and then he returned a year later to make Alvaro Paraiso. He might have been attracted to that city because it's a port city, and therefore it has these connections well beyond Chile, and connections to, if you like, the whole trading system of international capitalism, the whole colonial history. Chris Marker wrote the commentary, and I'll come on to that, very surrealist commentary. And Patricio Guzman was also part of the production team. Patricio Guzman, Chilean, who would later, not much later, 10 years later, he would be making Battle of Chile, about Salvador Allende's popular unity movement, which was overthrown, of course, by Augusto Pinochet's fascist coup. So watching Valparaiso, there is a dialectics of history there, because you can't really watch that film without thinking about the subsequent history, just 10 years later. So the Spanish conquistadors discovered the Bay of Valparaiso in 1536. Valparaiso means paradise in Spanish. And that colonial legacy is still evident today. Certainly was evident when Joris Ivens was making his film. And it's reminiscent really of Frantz Fanon talking about the colonial city as a world cut in two between the native world and the colonial world, divided into compartments, divided between those with full bellies and those with empty stomachs, and so forth. So in the film, the dialectical image emerges really around the cable cars and the stairs. The cable cars and the stairs connect the poor in the hills, in the barrios, with the centre of the port. Connect them with food, with water, with work. And they features constantly throughout the film, which is a collage, a non-linear collage, a mosaic of images, clustered around certain themes or visual similarities. So, for example, you see a shot of seagulls flying, and then that cuts to human bodies in the air as they're jumping into the sea. So you have these kind of visual associations. So it's a film built around the life of the city, people working, people going up and down the stairs, people flying kites, seagulls, people putting out their washing lines, everyday life, but always coming back to this class fissure in the city, which is represented by the stairs, people trudging up, people going down, and the cable cars. It's got this surrealist commentary. All women of Valparaiso bring out their parasols to walk all the penguins of Valparaiso. All the bridges jut into midair, all the homes a triangle. For each one of those statements, he finds an image that seems to correspond with this. So there is indeed, bizarrely, a woman walking a penguin. But of course, he's being playful with the image here, because not everyone is walking penguins. He finds a bridge that sort of is cut off, but of course not all the bridges are cut off. He finds a home that looks like it's kind of has a triangle kind of wedge-like structure, but of course not all the homes are triangles. So he's playfully trying to undermine the way in which the image usually works in a documentary. The image usually stands for a general truth, and he's kind of playing with that by making absurd statements. There's a lot of lists in the film, in the voiceover, because surrealists like lists. One climbs panting. It's funny. It's tiring. It's abominable. Joyful, inhuman, solemn, ridiculous, and strange. And he asks pointed questions like, what price the white blouses, the clean faces when water arrives in barrels? The film has a structure, although it's a collage, it does have a structure, and it gradually moves higher and higher into the barrios. The higher you go, the poorer the people become. And right at the top, the poorest of the poor, we first see the signs of... Is that how long I've been talking? I've been a bit slow, sorry. Right at the top is where you see the first forms of political organisation. People, a citizens' assembly talking about their problems and what they can do about them, a kind of anticipation of the kind of politics that will flower 10 years, or less than 10 years later under Allende. And then we move to a dance hall, they're dancing to Chilean music and Western music, and you kind of wonder what happens to those people. In a few years' time, they'll be in the middle of a socialist revolution, and then they will be facing a fascist takeover. And the film seems very prophetic. It's set in Valparaiso, which is where the CIA-sponsored coup was launched in 1973. And in Costa Gavras' film Missing, that's the character who is missing, Charlie Horman, that's where he meets the military CIA attaché in Valparaiso, and that's what seals his fate, because he's seen too much. Anyway, I might speed on a little bit, because I'm going to speed on over to... The very final shot of the film is it goes into colour after a little interlude. It moves from black and white to colour. And there's the shot of a bride with her bridal crown flowing out of one of the cable cars. And that crown that's flowing, it has a kind of association with some seaweed that we saw earlier on. And over the voiceover at that moment is talking about the sirens have not ceased to be singing in the port of Valparaiso. And of course the sirens were a sign of danger. So the film kind of ends on a sort of optimistic note about the future, but also a sign of foreboding, because there's very prophetically the film understands the dangers of a new kind of adventure in social justice, which is what the film ends calling for. Anyway, I'm going to speed on and go to the settlers. So this is a narrative fiction film, but we can apply the idea of dialectical images to this story, and there are there's 5 layers, if you like, to this dialectical structure. The British Empire versus the American Empire, the expectations of a revolt versus the fact that a revolt never happens in the film, despite us being the expectation that it will. It never happens. There's a dialectic between the violence that we see and the violence that we don't see. There's a dialectic between the exterior setting, where we see all this violence, and the bourgeois interior, which is a place of culture. And then there's a final dialectic at the end of the film between the fictional story that we've seen and the end credits, which uses real archived documentary footage. So I'm going to quickly go through it. So the film starts with an act of violence. A worker loses half his arm putting up a fence, a private fence, significantly. And the British lieutenant there arrives, the overseer, and just simply shoots the man dead because he's now useless to the employer. And this is the first act of violence that is witnessed by the mestizo character Segundo. He witnesses violence all the way through. There's constant shots of him witnessing violence, and we're expecting him in the end to act. The lieutenant's the lieutenant's boss, Menendez, arrives and gives him a new job. He's got to go to another part of this remote territory where Indians have cut down the fences and killed his sheep, and he's got to clear them out the way. So the lieutenant takes Segundo, who is a good shot, but Menendez also insists that he takes an American that he's also hired called Bill. Oh, sorry. So here we have two characters. Usually they're in separate genres, the Western and a kind of colonial adventure story. The fact that they're brought together here in the same story is a kind of dialectical image, because what we see here are these two empires which they kind of represent. The British Empire, which dominated Latin America in the last part of the 19th century through trade and investments, and the American Empire that will dominate Latin America in the 20th century. Their partnership and their tensions between them seems to speak to this. And again, you can see Segundo in the background witnessing all this. Bill is constantly telling the lieutenant that Segundo is going to turn on them, that he's got a weapon and he's going to fire on them. So you're kind of expecting that to happen. And they find some Indians on the land, and they simply, at dawn, in a very brutal scene, they just simply gun them down. And Segundo is here. He's watching this. He's supposed to participate. He sees Bill killing the Indians. And you can see in these shots him going through cycling through this kind of process of trauma, then apparently determination as he puts the gun to his shoulder. It looks like he's going to turn on the colonizers. But in the end, he can't take that final Fanonian step. He can't turn the violence on them. And then you see in that final shot down here, his anguish when he realizes that actually he cannot pull the trigger. His revolt is stillborn. Then they meet a mysterious figure, a British officer called Colonel Martins, who has a very large armed group with him. And Colonel Martins invites them, really forces them to dinner. And here we find out more about the lieutenant. We find out that he's actually not a lieutenant. He's just an ordinary soldier. And when Bill finds this out, he's outraged at this kind of class masquerade, and he calls Bill an English red pig, even though Bill is actually Scottish. Sorry, he calls McLennan an English red pig, even though he's Scottish. And at that point, Colonel Martins shoots Bill and makes an offer to McLennan. He will give McLennan an Indian woman from his camp if he allows McLennan, who is also a former officer in the British Army, to satisfy his cravings. And so we then get another, the act of violence, we've seen lots of sexual violence against the Indians, we've seen lots of rapes. Now the violence is turned on the colonizer, not from Segundo, but from another colonizer, the British officer. So it has an interesting class dimension as well, as Martins satisfies his cravings and rapes McLennan. The next morning, the party leave. Again, you see the woman give Segundo a sharp stone, and you think that is going to be the weapon that he will use against McLennan, but it doesn't happen. This scene, you see them riding off, and then very unexpectedly, the film cuts to 7 years later, a temporal ellipsis. And we find out after that 7 years, after that ellipsis, we find out that what we've seen so far is just the prelude to the violence. that actually McClellan went on to commit vast scales of violence and murder against the Indians. Hundreds and hundreds. So this is the kind of prelude, but that violence is on such a scale that it's almost unrepresentable. It's sort of a hole, an absence, a silence which the film constructs itself around. But somehow this violence on this scale has to be reckoned with, has to be remembered in some way. But again, it's interesting that that larger violence happens after McClellan has himself been violated. So you have this kind of cycle of violence expanding outwards. And the scene that we cut to is the bourgeois interior. We're at Menendez's house. The daughter there is on the piano. His daughter is on the piano. She's singing a lullaby, All the Pretty Horses. The daughters in their frilly dresses. The Monsignor listening there. And Menendez there as well, falling asleep a bit, older, less vital. So this is the bourgeois space of culture which has been built on all this violence, interior, exterior, another dialectical image. And into this space is also politics. Mr. Vicuña arrives from the capital, and stories of the violence have floated back to the capital, and he's there to try and persuade Menendez to make peace with the remaining Mapuche Indians. Why? Because the centenary of the nation is coming up soon, and they want to construct a mythology of the nation as a unified modern nation where everyone has a place. And so then in the final scenes, Vicuña goes and finds Segundo and Rosa, the woman that was given to McClellan, presumably as a sexual object. He finds them on a remote island off the coast of Chile. He goes there and he records what happened. This is where we find out the scale of the violence. But he's not recording this for the public. It's not for public consumption. It's not for social justice. What is it for? Maybe some more leverage over Menendez. What he's really there for is to collect some footage of the happy Indians who are now part of the modern nation. He's become a film director, and you can see him here in this image directing the cameraman. He's got Segundo and Rosa all dressed up in their best clothes. They're drinking tea. And this is a little attempt to construct this kind of nice anthropological image. And the very final shot of the film is Rosa staring directly into the camera, and Vicuña is saying, Rosa, drink the tea. Do you want to be or not want to be part of the nation? And she's just staring into the image. This might be, staring into the camera, this might be one act of defiance, but we don't know for sure. Maybe she probably did drink the tea. And the point is, I think, that there is a narrative expectation and a historical expectation that people will revolt, that people will resist. And the film has cunningly cultivated our expectation that Segundo will revolt, and he never does. He always just remains a witness and a participant to the violence. And in a way, I think the film is teaching us that when people are ringed by, circled by superior force, revolt is actually less common. Actually, it's more common for people to submit. And so I think it's kind of deconstructing an expectation we may have. And I think it therefore fits with our historical circumstances, because the film is a kind of third cinema film, but in a very un-third cinema context. But the very final images of the film are the is a dialectic between the film that we've watched, a fictional film that has uncovered all this violence, and real archive documentary footage, including footage of Menendez's shipping empire, because Menendez was a real person, and so was McLennan. It's tinted all red, blood red, and we have the lullaby sung on the soundtrack. Hush-a-bye, don't you cry, go to sleep, my little baby. When you wake, you shall have all the pretty little horses. So Segundo's dream was to own a horse, and the lullaby is attempting to sing someone to sleep. In the aesthetic context in which it's been constructed here, of course, it's a warning. Don't go to sleep. It's a warning to awake from that kind of nightmare of history and look it fully in the face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wayne. We will make a quick Q&A now, and we will continue it until they drag us from here by brute force. I will ask the first question about settlers. In one of your books, you used a quote from Alexander Kluge. Kluge said Theodor Adorno liked the movies of Jean-Luc Godard because of his unique montage technique that we called it jump cut. And Adorno said, Kluge, that the missing images is the real cinema. He found it. In terms of missing images, invisible images, the ending of Settlers, what do you think about the ending of Settlers and the space, 7 years space between two images without anything shown, but a huge massacre? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the dialectics that I was identifying between the seen and the unseen, the violence that we see, which is, although brutal, it's quite small scale. We're talking a dozen, maybe, Indians who are massacred. That's the seen violence. But the unseen violence that we learn about when Vicuña speaks to Segundo right at the end, and he talks about massacres on a huge scale, hundreds and hundreds. I mean, it is a problem, isn't it, about how you represent things, how you represent violence. You know what? It is sometimes more effective not to see it, but the absence in itself is more thought-provoking for the nonsensuous idea that you're trying to convey. But it has to be carefully crafted. You have to construct this context, this aesthetic context, where that absence has power. So it's all about your kind of expectations as a spectator as you're watching the film. And the film is very clever in the way it teases you about what to expect. And that ellipsis is really unexpected, because you just are expecting the revolt. And when Segundo and Rosa are teamed up, you think, together maybe they will revolt, 2 against 1. Maybe she will give him the courage. She gives him this stone, so you think maybe she will give him the courage to turn against the oppressor. So it's always playing with your expectations. So I think, you know, one of the things I was trying to say was how a film or any work of art constructs its own context in which something like an absence acquires that powerful meaning that it has. So it's all about that kind of artistic construct.
Thank you. Now, a question from our guests. please.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I have two quick questions. My first one is about how you see Adorno's negative dialectical thinking in this framework of producing something counter Hegel in a sense of something that's not necessarily a movement towards some positive or newness, but something negative that's then reinserted back into the dialectical process. And my second question is I'm curious about the layers of dialectical systems in your discussion here, right? So we have this intensification of oppositions and contradictions in the images, the dialectical image, but it also seems to invite a dialectical response to the audience, right? The audience now has to dialectically kind of relate to the dialectical presentations and then somehow produce or work through dialectical oppositions and intensifications something. And I was curious if you could talk more about the audience's dialectical relationship to the image that it's itself already a dialectical presentation.
Yeah, so in terms of Adorno, his critique is about what he calls identity thinking, the idea. So it's a bit like what I was saying about the way Chris Marker's commentary undermines the apparent truthfulness that the image and the word usually kind of have in a conventional voiceover exposition of a documentary. That the image is supposed to be the evidence for a general statement. This is a kind of identity thinking. And negation is trying to disrupt that. So the dialectic is closely aligned to disrupting that settled sense of, yes, this is the truth of the matter in a kind of permanent, ahistorical, general way. And I think instead the dialectical, or the negative dialectic in Adorno's terms, or just the dialectic is offering something more provisional, more tentative. In terms of an artwork, it exists within the context of the artwork. This is, again, what I'm saying about it being carefully constructed. The meaning, as with Kuleshov's dialectical interplay of shots, the meaning exists within the film. And so there is that sense that it's a kind of like a Benjamin lightning flash. It's a provisional, tentative glimpse of something, yeah. So it's the image is the dialectical image is a kind of way of trying to undermine the false, if you like, the false universality and generality of language. And then, yes, absolutely, the dialectic requires a subject to be interacting with this work in a dialectical way. And I think, so that's the importance of Kant begins that process. And then Hegel and Marx develop that kind of subject-object relationship. And I think what's important here is the culture in which a film is produced and circulated, that there has to be a culture that is critically, has enough critical sort of currents in it that people will actually interact with the film in that way, that there's enough, you know, in the critical discourses surrounding the film, that people will recognize it, recognize that this is how they're supposed to kind of read the film or interact with the film, yeah? So it does depend on the culture as much as the film itself. The film will have to have a culture that is conducive for it to activate the subject in that way.
Thank you.
Just as an add-on to that, if you think about a popular culture version of this is George Romero's Zombie, which everyone is now very familiar with as a sign of, you know, capitalism and alienation. When it first happens, I think, you know, I think very few people probably recognise that, but gradually the films kind of educate the public, so it becomes now a popular culture thing, and you can see a reference to it in a pop culture movie, Twilight, where the characters go to the cinema and they come out and they say, oh, I think that these zombies are supposed to represent us, you know. So it's about education as well.
Semih Bey.
Pontecorvo'nun Kemeda filmiyle bu son aktardığı film arasında zamanın ruhu açısından farklılıklar var. Birisi bugünün dünyası üstünden geçmişi ve sömürgeciliği okurken Pontecorvo başka bir düzlemde ele alıyordu. İkisi arasında bir benzeşim var mı ve farklar nedir?
Monte Carlo
Or Pontecorvo. I thought you said Pontecorvo. Monte Carlo.
Monte Carlo.
Kemeda.
Kemeda.
Kemeda. Marlon Brando acting.
Oh, yeah. Pontecorvos. Yeah.
Okay, so what are the differences and the similarities between these two movies?
Settlers.
In terms of the spirit of the time and colonialism.
The difference between Burn, and this film, Settlers. I'm just trying to remember Burn. It's hard for me. I think there's a temporal ellipsis in that film, isn't there? But I am sorry. The thing is, I haven't seen it for a while. But Burn is very interesting. It's a very different film from Battle of Algiers. It has a completely different aesthetic. It deconstructs the star system, putting Marlon... That's a dialectic right there. Marlon Brando against... Pontecorvo claimed that the actor who plays the leader of the uprising hadn't even seen a film before. So that's an interesting example of how, I'm not going to talk about time because I can't remember the film, but I can talk about the dialectic there between Brando and this nameless, anonymous actor, the big in the world, and this nameless, I mean, what a thing to do for a director, incredibly bold thing to do. And it, you know, again, it's about your expectations that, you know, you would be drawn towards Brando as a spectator, but the film kind of deconstructs that, and really you understand that your sympathies and empathies really lie with the revolutionary leader. But I'm going to have to watch Burn again to really answer your question, I'm afraid, about time.
Thanks. I'm sorry, very poor English, but you explained the dialectic image in detail. Thanks. But these days, the spirit of times in movies include pessimism, malevolence, and spirits of despair. A kind of Heideggerian, Husserlian, Nietzschean analysis, very powerful in these days. How can you think? What kind of condition zeitgeist produced that kind of undialectical image? Very individual, very pessimistic, because especially last 2 decades, especially in Turkey, we have a kind of ideas, very, very pessimistic, very anti-dialectical ideas. What kind of objective conditions produce that kind of best movies? This is a film industry or new cultural somethings? What are you thinking about this?
I mean, to put it simply, it's the era of defeat and disorientation for anti-colonial struggles, for socialism. This is why I think Settlers is a very interesting film. I described it as a third cinema film in a very non-third cinema context, because third cinema came out of those anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolutionary struggles of the 60s and 70s. And it speaks to us because I think, as I said, the whole anticipation that there will be a revolt never happens, and that really is an allegory of our times. But it's a criticism, I think, of the expectation that revolt will happen, because actually it doesn't automatically happen. Most of the time, people will submit to superior force. So I think it really speaks to this moment, because we are all globally confronted by immensely powerful economic and political apparatuses. And in that context, I think the drift philosophically will be towards various alternatives like Heidegger and so on and so forth, pessimistic and individualistic, subjective.
One last question, please.
Hi, Dr. Wayne. So we can say that the public relations and advertisement industry altered the position of human beings and their historical materialist existence, right? So basically we can say that these things are not the focus theme anymore in the movies and advertisements and everything. So the main focus has been changed to the consumer individuals. So my question will be, according to you, what should be the resistance point for academicians, movie directors, and the producers?
The resistance point, well, I think there are always, I think actually, despite the very difficult conditions for filmmakers, I mean, The Settlers took many, many years to make, and partly because it had funding sources from so many different places, Germany, Sweden, UK, Denmark, as well as Argentina and Chile. So that does speak to something of the north-south power relations that Chilean filmmakers are enmeshed in, and many, many countries. Despite that, this film gets made. So there are many hurdles that the director had to overcome in terms of finance. The film comes out of a public interrogation of Chilean history, the real unmasking of the Menendez family and the atrocities they committed. So this is the filmmaker doing his or her public political duty, which is to take something that's already been in the public sphere, discussed, but kind of, if you like, deepen people's knowledge and particularly feeling, emotional, empathetic feeling. Again, that kind of comes back to the sensuous nature of the image. Because you can know something, you can think about it, but if you don't feel it as well, it's kind of, there's a disconnect. And film kind of can do that. It can unite the dialectic between the thought and the feeling. So I think that is the valuable service that filmmakers can perform. They can put into concrete images for a popular audience, much wider than, issues much wider than they would necessarily come across in the public sphere. And despite all the difficulties, you see that happening surprisingly often, I think, given the conditions and the hurdles. So they can never entirely extinguish resistance in the symbolic cultural resistance, right? Because symbolic cultural resistance isn't the same as, you know, other kinds of resistance. And so there are more subtleties involved and more ways around the problems.
Thank you all. Herkese teşekkürler. We will have a small gift for Mr. Wayne. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Efendim Profesör Doktor Mark Wayne'e teşekkür ediyoruz. Kendilerine kıymetli sunumlar için plaket takdim ediyoruz.
Thank you. That is lovely. Thank you.